Hello and welcome back to Blue Flag Bandits, the series that drives F1's worst cars since 2010, so you don't have to in the often desperate hunt for points. You join us in the very familiar surroundings of the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya as we test our 2015 challenger, the McLaren MP4-30. Before we get into the 2015 season and our GP2 engined car, let's talk about our 2014 season grinding in the Caterham CT05 during that team's final season in the sport. It was the second season in a row we failed to get a Q1 across all 19 rounds, though we did start in 15th at Monaco after penalties, and it took 19 rounds to score the only points of our campaign, the double points finale in Abu Dhabi. We finished 9th, meaning we ended the season with just 4 points, beating only Marussia in the constructors, but we did at least jump a few established cars in the drivers' standings, like Jean-Eric Vernon, Toro Rosso and Esteban Gutierrez in the Sauber. We did, however, bottle a few chances at points, notably Canada and Singapore, the latter meaning we've now failed to score at every track at least once since the beginning of this series. Lewis Hamilton would mirror his real-world Drivers' Championship, claiming his second in the series so far. Mercedes being dominant across the entire season, claiming their first Constructors' crown in Blue Flag Bandits, and I'm sure it won't be their last. And Vettel would claim third, in behind the Silver Arrows, while Red Bull claimed second, some distance behind the dominant Mercedes cars. So at least they didn't drown in their title defence, but the points gap was pretty large. The sixth season of Blue Flag Bandits would see a fairly static set of technical regulations after the sort of soft reset of 2014, but there were some minor alterations, most notably to the noses of the cars. While the noses were lower than they'd been in 2014, they did have to taper to a fixed linear rate, which outlawed the more explicit and questionable designs of the previous year. The number of power units that were permitted was reduced from 5 to 4 for 2015, meaning the engines had to run further across the entire season. There were some changes to the sporting regulations as well, many relating to penalties applied during engine component changes, something that will become very relevant very shortly. Penalties continue to be applied cumulatively for the replacement of individual components of a power unit, and if such a grid place penalty was imposed and the driver's starting position was such it could not be applied in full, i.e. they got a 10-place grid drop but they were starting last, the remainder of the penalty was no longer carried over to the next race, but was instead applied in the form of a time penalty during the race, corresponding to the number of grid spaces remaining on the penalty. That was pretty confusing, so it was tweaked after the 2015 British Grand Prix with immediate effect to make demotion to the back of the grid the maximum penalty for engine changes. Additional time penalties to be served during the race were, though, abandoned. Sebastian Vettel had kicked off a crazy driver market near the end of 2014, announcing he was leaving Red Bull and moving to Ferrari, replacing Fernando Alonso, who had moved to McLaren to partner Jenson Button, the team he had left controversially in 2007. Red Bull promoted Daniel Kvyat from Toro Rosso to partner Ricciardo, while Raikkonen remained at Ferrari to now partner Seb. Mercedes retained their driver lineup, as did Williams, Lotus and Force India, while the rest of the grid saw a shake-up. Caterham dropping out of the sport meant that Kobayashi would leave F1, while his teammate Marcus Ericsson would move to Sauber alongside Felipe Nasr, with Sutil and Gutierrez both dropping out the sport, though for Gutierrez it was a temporary sabbatical. Marussia would be saved at the last minute, re-entering the sport as Mana Marussia with Will Stevens and Roberto Merri, meaning that Max Chilton would leave for IndyCar. Toro Rosso would drop Verne in favour of some kid called Max Verstappen, whatever happened to him, and the son of a rally legend, Carlos Sainz Jr. The season's calendar was still 19 races, however Mexico returned for its first race since 1992 with a modified version of the Mexico City circuit. This race replaced the German Grand Prix. The event dropped from the provisional calendar and Hockenheim unable or unwilling to host for a second year running due to their pre-existing event sharing agreement. As previously mentioned, Caterham fell into liquidation at the end of the 2014 season, despite efforts to save them, while Marussia were also on the cusp of closing, which they did just prior to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix of 2014. It would have left the grid with 18 cars. Marussia, however, would be saved in February of 2015 and re-enter as Mana Marussia. There were some engine supply changes, as Honda re-entered Formula One as engine supplier to McLaren, something we'll get onto in a moment, with Mercedes supplying Lotus, the Enstone-based team ditching Renault engines for the first time since 1995. That leads us nicely to our car for 2015, the McLaren MP4-30, the first McLaren since 1992 to use a Honda engine, reuniting a once formidable partnership with much fanfare. The car would be chucked around by Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button, a team with 3 Drivers' Championships between them, and 2 incredibly gifted Formula One drivers. The MP4-30 was a size 0 car, the bodywork designed to be as close to the engine as possible so it could operate at higher temperatures. However, that didn't help, as the engine was as fragile as it was underpowered. A 5th place in Hungary for Alonso was as good as it got for McLaren all season, Alonso also missing the opening round after a pre-season crash, which meant that Kevin Magnussen stood in, but would be unable to start due to a technical issue. The cars both suffered at the hands of engine penalties, the pair racking up a cumulative 105 place grid penalty in Belgium, and ending the season with a total of 305 grid place drops through engine component changes. The 105 in Belgium was the peak of their stacked penalties over the course of the season, but as stated, a lot of the time McLaren found themselves getting penalised grid spots for having to change more bits of their fairly woeful Honda engine. They often found themselves getting penalties that far outstripped the number of cars on the grid. McLaren would end the season in 9th in the Constructors, their worst finish in 35 years, while Button and Alonso would be 16th and 17th respectively. Button's worst season since his final year at Honda in 2008. Surprise, surprise. And Alonso's worst since his debut with Minardi in 2001. Lewis Hamilton would take his third world title with ease in 2015, Mercedes once again dominating the field, and much like the season before, winning all but 3 races over the course of the season. Sebastian Vettel was the man who took the only non-Mercedes wins through 2015, driving for Ferrari. Red Bull would continue to struggle, slipping to 4th in the Constructors behind Ferrari and Williams, showing just how far the Renault engine at the back of the all-dominant Milton Keynes team's cars had fallen. An unusual aside for these introduction races, we need to briefly talk about F1 2015 as a game before we really truly get into it. This is the only game of all the Codemasters games since 2010 that doesn't have a career mode or allow custom drivers to be used. So unlike the previous seasons, where we'll be able to jump in a career mode and we'll have our objectives and all that sort of stuff, we will still, I believe, get those things. But we won't get any contract offers, there'll be no beat your rival and you might be able to take their seat. Obviously not that we've been doing that through the series. But also it won't be me driving. So, unlike previous seasons and future seasons where we can again be a custom driver, we're going to have to take one of the seats and be one of the real life drivers. It was a tough call between picking Fernando Alonso or Jenson Button. As I've mentioned, both world champion drivers, both race winners, and both fairly likeable guys. Always quite entertaining to see in interviews, and some of the shenanigans that Fernando got up to over the course of this season with McLaren stick particularly well in the mind. However, come join us as we become Jenson Button for 2015, heading to Woking for the first and probably only time in Blue Flag Bandits, unless they absolutely fall off a cliff in 2026 or beyond. Driving a car that was more often seen on the side of the road than anywhere near the points. After the grind that was 2014, our pre-season race here in Spain at least got us hoping we could compete a little bit more. We ran fairly comfortably in the points, and while you may not see the end of this, we did actually finish 5th. There were a few AI bottles up ahead, but we were comfortably able to maintain a good position. Getting over the low bars of 2013's Marussia season and 2014's Caterham season should be fairly easy, though anything can happen in Formula 1, and it very often does. Once again, running 50% races with legendary AI, rules and flags on, and traction control on, because believe me, it's tough to try and get your head around these games after being away from them for a decade, when you're only jumping in to do a couple of races and then going away again for a couple of weeks, maybe at a time. As has often been the case in the other seasons, we're competing against the 2 closest teams to us, obviously back at the start. That was the other new entrants of 2010, but as they've begun to fall by the wayside, we're now competing against the 2 teams that the real world team we're driving for were closest to. That was Mana Marussia, who were 10th and last in the standings with 0 points, and Sauber, who finished 8th. So by the end of 2015, McLaren were behind Sauber. I do, however, think we can battle a little higher up the field. As I say, spent quite a lot of this race actually early part fighting with Red Bulls, and we should, I think, be able to outmatch the likes of Sauber on a fairly consistent basis. Onwards then to another season, and one that could be our new high watermark unless we find ourselves on the side of the road as often as Jenson Button and Fernando Alonso did in the real life 2015. A decade before the team could take 2 straight Constructors' crowns and a driver's title, at least one at the time of recording, we get to see the lowest of the lows for the legendary Woking-based outfit. So, let's get to work and see if we can somehow bring the MP4-30 some glory. Before we get into that very first race of the season, like, share, comment, subscribe, do all the good stuff. You know the drill by now. I'll leave you with the black McLaren flying around Spain for just a little bit longer, and you can get a little bit of a feel for what we're going to be driving in 2015. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.